Good afternoon, and welcome to a webinar on food defense hosted by EAS Consulting Group and presented by EAS Independent Consultant, Dr. Kathy Knudsen, and EAS Independent Advisor for FSMA, Charles Breen. EAS specializes in FDA regulatory matters with a prime focus of assisting domestic and foreign food, pharmaceutical, dietary supplement, medical device, tobacco, and cosmetics firms comply with applicable laws and regulations. EAS is staffed with former FDA compliance and inspection officials and industry executives and is assisted by an extensive network of consultants with many years of FDA and industry experience. Today's presenters are Dr. Kathy Knudsen and Charles Breen. Kathy Knudsen is a Ph.D. microbiologist and certified lead instructor for preventive controls for qualified individuals through the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance. She consults with companies in meeting FSMA requirements, including manufacturers in the cannabis industry. Kathy has a Ph.D. in food science from the University of Minnesota, and prior to consulting, worked as a food safety educator and proficiency program coordinator for Northland Laboratories. Charles Breen began consulting with EAS after a distinguished career at FDA, working in areas such as HACCP and LACF and BSC prohibitive materials and dairy. Mr. Breen has worked with industry on compliance issues related to the Bioterrorism Act of 2003 and led the field and headquarters professionals in developing and implementing surveillance and compliance programs and initial FSMA training implementation. As an EAS Independent Advisor, Mr. Breen is a frontline resource for FSMA compliance, including FSVP for foreign firms exporting products to the U.S. and food defense challenges. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may ask any questions by typing them into the questions box. And with that, I will say thank you again for joining EAS, and I'll turn the presentation over to Charles.
Hello, and thank you very much for joining us. Strategies to protect food. This is food from those who would do harm intentionally. We're going to talk about mitigation strategies a little bit, but more on important terms, how HACCP and preventive control analyses resemble but are not the same as doing a vulnerability assessment for intentional adulteration. I'll introduce what FDA's program is going to be to begin looking at facilities' compliance with the intentional adulteration rule and describe some helpful resources. Okay, intentional adulteration. These are hazards that are introduced into food with the intent to cause harm. Introduced and intent and wide scale are the key terms here. This is not the occasional form of a disgruntled employee. This is because someone wants to cause a lot of harm to a lot of people, and it is deliberate. It is not accidental. It is with intent. And wide-scale public health harm is the goal. There are food security issues that are not related to intentional adulteration, but we're not going to be touching on them here today. Exemptions. The Food and Drug Administration figures that the number of food facilities that need to have mitigation strategies to protect food is a subset of all food manufacturers. And the primary exemption is a very small business, which for this rule is defined as under $10 million on a rolling 3-year average, inflation adjusted. Right now, the figure is $11 million in change for annual dollar volume. If your annual dollar volume is below that, all you have to do is document it is below that. Warehouses are exempt unless those warehouses store food in liquid storage tanks, whether it's corn syrup or milk. If it's a liquid storage tank, then a warehouse is not exempt. Packing or repacking, relabeling of food. This is when it stays in its container from the manufacturer or from wherever it was received. If it's in its final package and you're taking cases of 100 and breaking them down into cases of 10, then as long as the consumer package remains intact, you are exempt from this rule. All activities that fall within the definition of a farm are exempt. Animal food is exempt. Alcoholic beverages are exempt. And the alcoholic beverage exemption parallels the preventive controls for human food rule. If you're registered with Tobacco Tax Bureau, or if you would otherwise have to be registered if located in the US. And that's a good point I should make here. This rule applies to foreign and domestic firms equally. The exemptions apply to foreign and domestic firms equally. And the final exemption is on-farm manufacturing and certain low-risk production practices. And this includes some types of eggs, which is a very complex rule to distinguish between what is or isn't FDA and USDA. We won't be getting into that. And certain types of game meat. Now, a vulnerability. It's the place where someone can do a lot of harm. It's defined here. I don't have to read it for you, but this is vulnerability. You can think of it in terms of preventive controls for human food as the hazard that this rule is meant to address. There are some distinctions, but the discipline of doing a hazard analysis for preventive controls is the same kind of thinking that would be applied to assessing vulnerabilities. I think of it as you use a car to go to two different destinations. Your actions in the car, speeding up, slowing down, turning are the same, but you get to different places. Actionable process step. This is a term which is not defined in the regulation, but it is used in FDA's guidance. This is where of significant vulnerability exists. And if applied here, it should significantly reduce or minimize or eliminate the hazard, the vulnerability, excuse me. For the intentional adulteration rule, the correct term is vulnerability. Please excuse me if I misspeak again. Key activity types. One of the things that FDA has done for industry is to provide its analysis of what it has seen as the key activity types that are consistently ranked as the most vulnerable. And this covers all food commodities. Bulk liquid and receiving, loading, liquid storage and handling, secondary ingredient mixing, well, mixing and similar activities. This is where things can be introduced that can cause harm. Liquid is pretty easy to understand. A contaminant would be distributed in a large volume and could be distributed widely in a very short period of time. Liquid storage and handling, same thing. Secondary ingredient mixing is the smaller ingredients that might be added to food, like vitamins or food colors. Those kind of activities are where a contaminant could be introduced that could then become widely distributed in the food. Mixing and similar activities when ingredients are being mixed together is also an area that is a key activity type. And I seem to have lost control of these slides. There we go. Let me make sure I didn't skip one here. Okay. This is just simply a diagram to illustrate that food safety, food quality, and food fraud are all closely related, and intentional adulteration is related but is separate. It is important to make the distinction. You may be using the same kind of thought processes, but you're talking about hazards that are not well characterized, are not predictable, are not, they don't have a lot of science behind them for the likelihood of occurring. These require human intervention to commit and human intervention to prevent. This is just to illustrate some of the similarities and differences. For preventive control hazard analysis, there's the three-part test that is how you determine whether or not there's a hazard that needs a control. It's known or reasonably foreseeable, how much harm it might cause, and the probability that it will occur in the absence of controls. For a vulnerability assessment, there is the similar public health potential, the severity and scale, which is similar to severity of illness or injury in preventive controls. But it does require a different analysis. Different facts go into that decision as to what its public health impact could be. The degree of physical access to the product. How easy is it for someone to get to a process step or a facility import valve, something that is a place where contamination could occur. And then also the ability of the attacker to successfully contaminate the product. If a vulnerability exists where something is easily accessible, but the ability to attack would be hard, then there's a different degree of mitigation that would need to be applied in that area. This is a capsule summary of what a food defense plan must be. For anyone who has prepared a food safety plan, you will recognize that this is a parallel track. It's not the same road, but it's off to the side with different results, but the same kind of discipline and thinking, the same kind of analysis, the same kind of demands upon your facilities. To identify the vulnerabilities and where the vulnerabilities can be mitigated in an actionable process step. To identify what strategies will be used. To implement and know what mitigation strategies are and how they are managed. And to actually implement the procedure itself. To implement corrective action if something were to occur that got outside of or around a mitigation strategy, what would you do? And to establish verification activities to know that your mitigation strategies are actually being implemented. It calls for a reanalysis on a 3-year cycle unless something happens in which you need to do an earlier one. All individuals who have responsibilities have to qualify to perform those responsibilities. And of course, records. Everything above requires record keeping. There are some compliance dates. For large firms, it has passed. It was July 26th of this year to have a food defense plan in place. For small businesses, which is less than 500 FTE, but over the $10 million inflation adjusted figure annual dollar volume, it's July 27 of next year. And for the very small businesses, it's July 26 of 2021. They need to have documentation of their dollar volume to be able to show FDA during any routine inspection, here's why we don't have to have a mitigation strategy to protect against intentional adulteration. I think it's still a good idea that small firms at least look at the intentional adulteration rule. It's one of the most it is the most compact rule in FSMA so far. It comes in about 15 pages. I found it to be the most readily understandable once you have the vocabulary down. I think that being the last rule, FDA actually did get better at writing rules, and this is the end result. It is not difficult to read the 15 pages and get a good idea of what is necessary. That said, doing it is a little bit of a challenge, but Kathy will get into that more later. In March of 2020, FDA will begin what it's calling QuickCheck Intentional Adulteration Inspections. There are a number of reasons that they claim to provide credible oversight. This is the first rule of its kind in the world. So FDA needs to both be credible and to be seen as credible. They will begin in March of 2020 to make some baseline inspections to look at compliance oversight and education. The data they use is going to be used to prioritize comprehensive inspections as they go forward. It'll also help FDA to identify where more focused assistance is needed to industry. Regulate while educate. Education is what FDA is saying right now. This independent adulteration, intentional adulteration rule will require a lot of additional education time. The QuickCheck will be about 10 questions or so that basically say, show me where you've got this in your food defense plan. There will be no record collections. And as a consequence, there'll be no regulatory action on the basis of a QuickCheck inspection. It's expected to take another 60 to 90 minutes added on to a routine inspection. And eventually they'll be included in state contract inspections pending contract working. The QuickChecks will continue for several years. Now, during that time, there will be a small number of in-depth inspections that prioritize facilities. These will be the places where FDA believes significant vulnerabilities may exist. The public health impact, if a contamination event to occur, would be large, and where they believe that they can help the industry by knowing more about what is being done and how to help industry prevent it. It will be done by specially trained investigators. That training is going on now. And it will cover a critical evaluation of the food defense plan, its conclusions, and the rationale for those conclusions. So unlikely, but it will be coming to a small number of firms. Now the QuickCheck inspections to continue, FDA will be using the results from the QuickChecks to train its own food defense investigators. And I am speculating here that the comprehensive intentional adulteration inspections are for the prevention of a felony. It is possible this will be an OCI program, an Office of Criminal Investigations program, but if not, it will be done in coordination or at least closely associated with the Office of Criminal Investigations, because if an event occurs, OCI will be there. They won't be there to criminally investigate you so much as the event. As long as you have done what you're supposed to according to the intentional adulteration rule, the OCI people are there to help prevent harm to the public. The QuickCheck inspections will be developing a prioritization process, so FDA knows where it can spend its limited resources to have the most positive effect for industry. And the results will be used to feedback for refining inspections and consistent application. That last point is very important to FDA. They want to be consistent across the entire universe of firms that are subject to this rule. There are resources available. There are so many resources available for this. Training for the individual intentional adulteration qualified individuals under a standardized curriculum, similar to that for preventive controls qualified individual. There is a standardized curriculum. There are FDA web pages with extensive guidance. There's public outreach. There's the FDA Technical Assistance Network. There's the Food Safety Prevention Controls Alliance training, and there are consultants such as EAS. But if you're new to the subject and you want to find out what you need to know, I would suggest going to FDA's FSMA webpage first and begin to read some of the guidance there. There's a lot of material that is designed to help you know what you should be doing. And let me turn it over to Kathy Knudsen now. I'm sorry, Knudsen.
Thank you, Charles. Excellent job on that information. That was a lot of information. Before I tried to chime in, I'm sorry about that. I had lost volume on my end because it went over to another one of my Bluetooth devices. So I apologize. Hopefully we can edit that out if it did come through before. But I am excited to be here with all of you. I saw the roster of companies who are listening in, and I see some of my clients there. So as my background adds to this, I am all about training and education and very detail-oriented in the nitty-gritty. What do we really have to do? So my part of the presentation will get a little bit more specific. There will be some overlap, of course. And we have implementing a food defense plan. Oops. Okay, there we go. So for my portion, I will talk about the implementation of the food defense plan, building your food defense team, training of your employees, again, resources like Charles was talking about as far as identifying those vulnerabilities. How do you know that you've gotten those vulnerabilities identified? And a little bit more information about the FDA key activity types, or the CATs. So my first key point, I really want to jump ahead, theoretically. Imagine that you have a written food defense plan and you're implementing that. What is a culmination of this going to look like? And so when this kind of giving you the big picture, what do we have to get to? And then I'll go back and backtrack and give you some more details. So you are going to identify mitigation strategies. What is your monitoring going to be? What record keeping are you going to have? And think ahead to what potential corrective action will occur should there be an attack or a potential attack. As you go through the food defense plan process, what has been really helpful for me is to create my own little cheat sheet of the acronyms that are used, like IA is the same as food defense, and then also any terms that are specific to food defense plan. And as Charles had talked about, and what I will continue to talk about, is we have this parallel concept to HACCP. And so with HACCP, we have a hazard analysis critical control points. And then on the food defense side, we have either TACCP or VACCP, which is threat assessment and critical control points, or vulnerability assessment and critical control points as well. And then even though you're writing a food defense plan in the same way that you have written a food safety plan, because this is new, most of my clients will do a side-by-side action plan. And the action plan is figuring out what documents have to be written, figuring out what programs have to be implemented, what kind of training do you need to do. So what are the to-do lists? And that very often becomes an action plan where you have people at your company responsible for making sure that those steps get done. And then by the end, you have your whole food defense plan. And so some of the steps that you're going to need on that action plan will require budgetary requests going up to management. And of course, you'll have training. And then the last thing on this slide, what are you already doing that applies to the implementation? And so you're going to use many of the things that you are already doing. Do not think of this as reinventing the wheel. And so my next slide should show that. You are already implementing food defense, and it is only a matter of identifying those procedures or policies that you have in place already and now calling them food defense. And maybe in the past you've only thought of them as food safety, but we're going to call them food defense. So for example, when you do a food defense plan, you are going to think of all vehicles coming off of the public road and into your property. So think about how you drove to work today. As soon as you came off that public road, then That is where food defense starts. So do you already have restricted access to your property? Do you already have a fenced-in property? That now is part of your food defense. Then you get to the buildings. And so we have secure the integrity and access to your buildings. And in the same way that you're already doing that, to make sure that all of the various types of vehicles and people in those vehicles are going to the right entrances and bays, and their paths are obvious. Visitors, that becomes part of your food defense as well. Identify and restrict access of visitors. If I were to come to your facility, I would have my directions on how to get there, park, what door to come in, and that whole process is already there for visitors, your contractors, and of course your employees, your truck drivers. Do you already have security cameras? You probably don't have security cameras covering every square inch of your facility, but any security cameras that you have outside or inside are now part of your food defense. Are you securing your chemical supplies that are used by sanitation, that are used by maintenance? That's already part of our GMPs. And so yes, you're doing that. Training personnel. And so now we're going to train our personnel in food defense. So now, backtracking. Actually, I have one more note. So sorry. Let me see if I can go back. Oh, I can't go back. Amy, I am not given power to go back. Can you go back? Right. One more. There you go. Thank you about that. If I click, I can go ahead, but I can't go back. So my other point that I don't have on this slide is talking about those GMPs that are in your facility already for food defense. You are also going to have prerequisite programs. So as we look at this bulleted list, and I'm on slide 24, and so I know that there are people out there that are trying to write all this down. You know that you're going to get the slides, or I hope you know that you're going to get the slides, but I suggest that you write down the slide number, so I'm on slide 24. You will have prerequisite programs under food defense in the same way that you have GMPs for food safety. And then as you go through this process of writing your food defense plan, you will identify if that prerequisite program goes to a higher level of becoming a mitigation strategy. And so some of the prerequisite programs will stay as such, and some of them will move to the next level. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now back to build the food defense team and backtracking a little bit. The first point is food defense is agent agnostic. And by that, what we mean is we don't know what the attack agent is going to be. It may be biochemical, it may be biological, it may be chemical, it may be physical. It honestly does not matter. You and your food defense team will not spend any time talking about what if this agent is used, what if this toxin is used, what if this chemical is used. All of your time will be spent on identifying vulnerabilities and restricting access at those weak points in your facilities. The other thing is that food defense plan is facility specific, so if you are part of a corporate structure, you cannot have a corporate-wide food defense plan. It must be specific to your facility, and that's because each of our facilities are unique, starting from that point of when a vehicle leaves the road and then people come into your facility. You will have a cross-functional team for the food defense team, and so the people that you're working with, and I know some of the companies on the webinar do have teams that are on the webinar, you do want to have a team that is robust. What types of positions do you want on the team, such that if the person in that position were to move on, move up perhaps to a different position or move on to another company, you would still have whoever is in that position. So for example, maybe human resources manager, whoever is the human resource manager would be on the team. And then I do want you to think outside the box. And so for the next indent there, who do you want on the team? In addition to thinking about the different positions on the team that are representative of different parts of your company, there may be individuals who are perfect for the food defense team. And so if you're at a company and you have security personnel on site, either in a guard shack or inside the door, either at the visitor's entrance, the employee entrance, there may be individuals that you want on the team because of the skill set that they already have. What has come up in the course of my working with clients, I can't take credit for this, but it was a huge aha moment for me when someone said, well, we have ex-military trained personnel here. So if you somehow, working with human resources and working with your people, figure out who already has been trained in military strategy and military tactics, those employees naturally have an understanding of attack, and that's what you are preventing with this. And they maybe have already identified vulnerabilities, and they maybe have identified things that should be done in order to stop a potential attack. And then the last one, of course, don't have too many people just because it needs to be workable. And so I recommend 8 or less, and that's just a ballpark figure, whatever works for you. Then I want to address qualified individual. So in the same way with the preventive controls for human food rule that every single employee must be qualified to do their position in regards to food safety, the exact same thing is true in that every employee must be qualified to do their job under food defense. And so I will give you some training resources, but that is an absolute, and once the FDA inspectors start asking, they will ask for training records for food defense. And so you are receiving training right now, and so I would put this training into your personnel file for this webinar. The food defense qualified individual bullet is in italics, and I'm on slide 26 if you want to make a note, because there is no formal title for this person. And so in Preventive Controls for Human Food, we call that PCQI. Here, I'm just making a distinction in that it is not the PCQI. It is the person probably at your facility who's the most highly trained. If that person is you because you're listening to this webinar, then tag you're it, but it is it should be someone who is different from the PCQI. However, when you look at all these responsibilities, it's going to exactly parallel the responsibilities of a PCQI, but now looking at food defense. So this individual, unique to the facility, because remember this is facility specific, prepares the food defense plan, conducts the vulnerability assessment, identify and explain, is able to identify and explain the mitigation strategies, and will do reanalysis of the food defense plan. So I hope that you will see that this needs to be done by the team, but in the rule, these 4 responsibilities are spelled out for a qualified individual at your facility. So more about training, that food defense qualified individual or the person who is responsible for making sure that those 4 things on the previous slide are done needs an extra level of training, needs more training than what all the other employees are going to get. And so some resources for that. The training that I received, I became a lead instructor for PCQI in January of 2016. The intentional adulteration rule was published in May of 2016, and a year later, in May of 2017, I went to Minnesota, and that was for the training provided by Food Protection and Defense Institute, or FPDI. And if you look at the address, the website address, it is University of Minnesota, and that is why it has the EDU web address. They are a center of excellence, but that is specifically with Homeland Security. So they're a Homeland Security Center of Excellence. They've been doing this for years and years and years, and they have many, many resources in addition to their training and conferences that they host. And one of the great things about FPDI is the resources of their databases. And on a worldwide basis, they are following attacks, potential attacks, alerts, working with other countries and people who are doing this in other countries as well. Great resource. In addition, we have our alliance, FSPCA, and when you go to the FSPCA website, on the homepage, there is a link to the web page, which is Intentional Adulteration Rule. And once you get to that web page, then you will see absolutely free online training. And this is what I would like you to start encouraging management to have everybody trained. So every employee can be trained in food defense awareness. It is approximately a 20-minute online presentation. At the end, if the computer is hooked up to a printer, they will get a certificate, and that can go in their personnel file, and you can make sure that everybody has been trained in food defense awareness. And then for your supervisors and your managers, there's an additional free online training right there that ends in a certificate as well for documentation, and that is IA rule overview for them. And I would encourage you to do this now with your employees, but then instill it into your onboarding process and work with your human resources personnel. If you have a temp agency, that's something they can take over for you, because you can access that free training for employees from anywhere. So this is a question that I always get, and I'm going to address it right away. It is a myth. If I train my employees on food defense, I am increasing my risk of attack. And so that's not true at all, and that's why it's a myth. So first of all, let's just think about our training of every single employee in food defense, and that is an awareness training. You do not have to tell them where your vulnerabilities are. You do not have to tell them your mitigation strategies. You don't have to explain to them the security camera system. You're not getting into that detail. What you are getting into is see something, say something. And you want every pair of eyes with every employee to have the awareness of food defense, because they're your best resource, and you're not going to increase your risk of attack. My perspective on the inside attacker and the disgruntled employee is they're already plotting, they're already scheming. By giving them an awareness training of food defense, you are not going to do any harm as far as helping them to think that through, and you may, in fact, squash it and stop it. So here we have, right, the food defense plan. There is no form. There is no format. It does have to be written. All the same characteristics apply to your food safety plan, in that you can have hard copy, you can have electronic copy, you can have it stored wherever you want to store it. You just need to have it available. And the most important point that I have for you on this slide is just jump in. Just start doing this process. Don't wait for team members to do a lot of reading, even though there's a lot of resources available. Don't have people get overly bogged down with trying to figure things out. Just jump in and start doing it, because your team members are bringing their expertise to the food defense team, and they're just going to take off and do it, which will be great. The team will take off. So 4, conduct a vulnerability assessment. It is absolutely a team activity. Do not do this on your own. The food defense vulnerability assessment is analogous to the food safety hazard analysis. And so if you have been through that process for HACCP or your food safety plan, you understand the depth of the discussions that you're going to have. You understand the importance of doing this step really well. And so in the vulnerability assessment, the whole purpose is to identify vulnerabilities. And we do start with, let's identify every single vulnerability on Earth that we could potentially have at this facility. And then we will start to go to the next step after we have identified the vulnerabilities. So the vulnerabilities are your weak points. And I want to talk a little bit more about the scope, meaning where does it start and where does it stop. And I have the 2 bullets, which are starting at transport of materials to receiving at your facility and going all the way through to your primary package being sealed around the food. So back to transport of materials to receiving, and how I've said that a vehicle coming off of the road is where the physical part of food defense starts. However, when a delivery truck is at your bay and your receiving personnel are determining whether or not they can offload that ingredient, they have to know that there has not been a breach in security during transport. And a lot of this you are already doing. You are receiving trucks that are locked or have parts locked, hatches locked. You have the inspection of gaskets. There's a lot of ways at receiving that you can identify that the ingredient that's coming off has not been tampered with. And again, that becomes now part of food defense. And resources. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. It's slide 32. You'll get it again. So your employees, second one, Food Protection Defense Institute, online, USDA FSIS has Food Defense Mitigation Tool. And these resources are not going to narrow down which ones you need to focus on. Only your team is going to be able to identify the ones that require a mitigation strategy. But all of these tools are for brainstorming. What are potential vulnerabilities? And they're extremely detailed and helpful. Another resource is the additional courses that are offered by the Alliance, and those are for cost. And there is an IA training cheat sheet where you can see that. The FDA rule, of course, and the guidance document. There is a guidance document from the FDA on the intentional adulteration rule, which is incomplete. It has been published 2 of 3 parts, and we're still waiting for the 3rd part to come from the FDA. FDA, we're waiting. And then the next bullet as well, I have 2020 in italics because we don't know when the FDA is going to provide to us an updated food defense plan builder. So please do not use the FDA food defense plan builder as it exists now to write your food defense plan, because it is old and it was created before the rule was published. It's going to be updated. It is a good source for brainstorming. It will help your team to think about other ideas. And then the last ones as well, if you have certification, there are parts of those standards that are providing guidance for you. So our 4 key activity types are really what I focus on with clients. And the 4, well, first of all, there's a resource for this that I do highly recommend for you for brainstorming, and then it also gives you mitigation strategies, and that is the FDA Food Defense Mitigation Strategies database, publicly available. You will find that on the FDA website. And there are 4 CATs, and I'm going to talk about each one of those with a slide. There we go. So the first CAT of the 4 is bulk liquid receiving and bulk liquid loading. So receiving is inbound, loading is outbound if you have a liquid ingredient that your facility is manufacturing and shipping out. So typically the volume is large. So we're talking about tankers and truckloads of liquids coming in. And distribution of the agent is the problem that we want to stop here. If you have a truckload of a liquid, and if an agent were to be introduced, it could potentially mix homogenously through that whole volume of liquid and cause wide-scale public health harm, and that's why it's a CAT. And if you are receiving sealed containers like drums of liquid, that is not included here. This is literally offloading of a liquid or loading up of a liquid if it's leaving your facility, not sealed. So totes, drums, those kinds of things. Oops, sorry. Uh-oh. Doggone it. Amy, can you go back to the second CAT? Okay. All right, so that was the first one. One more. Thank you. Good, I got it. Here we go. Second one, liquid storage and handling. So these are now your on-site tanks. Then once you do have those totes or drums with liquid in them, and especially if they're partial use and have to go back into storage, those need to be identified. If you have any handling tanks, like a balance tank, or if you have a pump inside of a drum and that's open, that also is included here. This is for both liquid ingredients and liquid product or work in process. Again, it's about distribution. If an agent were to be added, and if that agent could get homogeneously mixed, and if it could be metered across a large amount of product, that needs to be identified. Okay. Secondary ingredient handling. This is where you have either a dry ingredient or a liquid ingredient, usually is going to be manipulated by human access. So if you have, for example, a flavor that is being poured out of a plastic jug and portioned out, but that then is going to be placed into a large volume, then that is a problem, potentially. And so we have secondary ingredient handling that way. Think about staging, preparation, addition, and storage of those secondary ingredients. Think about rework. Is it possible, whether the rework is internal or if you have something coming in from outside, is it possible that someone could put an agent into rework, that agent would then get distributed? So we have both the access and the distribution problem here. Last of the four, mixing and similar activities. Even though the CAT includes mixing, really you need to think about so many things with this. So blending, stirring, whipping, homogenizing, grinding, milling, coating, all of those types of activities where there's a great deal of mixing, whatever it is called on your flow diagram, identify those. And then another thing I want you to think about is any step where there are paddles or any type of agitation. Paddles, for example, leveling paddles. I was at a coffee roaster, and after the coffee roaster, the very next step is an open tank where there's paddles that are leveling it out and stirring it up. So those types of activities need to be looked at as to whether they are a vulnerability, and it's all about distribution. So all of that, the four CATs were discussed as all these. Remember, you're just brainstorming with your team and making sure that you've covered any potential vulnerabilities in your vulnerability assessment. There are so many other ways to do this. There are so many tools to do that, as I've talked about in the resources. One additional way to do this comes with FDA guidance from the IA rule guidance document, and it is called 3 fundamental elements. And this is very high level risk assessment with math that requires additional training and understanding. You are not required to do the 3 fundamental elements. You can, if you're satisfied, do the CAT, or you can follow your own team path. But I would very highly suggest that you document how you identified vulnerabilities, and then the next step is to document which of those vulnerabilities require mitigation strategies, and you will have justification for that, and you should have documentation of your team decisions for that. So I have covered, we have covered, Charles and I, the definition of intentional adulteration. We covered businesses, and Charles did a great job on the exempt businesses. Timeline for enforcement. So we know that FDA will start the QuickCheck in March of 2020. We talked about building the food defense team. We talked about resources for both training and identifying your vulnerabilities. And we talked about the key activity types. In addition, I'm going to leave you with one slide that just kind of throws all the next steps at you. And I also want to refer you back to Charles had 2 slides. It was called Capsule Summary and slide 13 and 14. In the first part, slides 13 and 14, 2 bulleted lists that really lay out kind of a checklist of this is what we have to do in order to write and implement our food defense plan. So here on my slide, we have identified vulnerabilities requiring mitigation. Again, reminding you that some of the vulnerabilities will be taken care of with prerequisite programs. Identify mitigation strategies at vulnerabilities and write the SOPs, or for example, with a receiving SOP, just revise it to address food defense. Again, don't reinvent the wheel here because you're already doing so much in favor of food defense. Then, once you have those mitigation strategies, there will be monitoring and record keeping. Determine ahead of time what your corrective action is going to be. So what is your response going to be? If there is failure at a vulnerability with a mitigation strategy, and it could just be something as simple as they forgot to document it. So when you know that when you do your record review, sometimes there's not complete documentation, you're going to have to figure out ahead of time, what are you going to do? So you do verification. Every time you do record review, you may in the future want to start mock attacks. And that would be a verification activity, and it would be verifying that if there were ever problems, there would be corrective action taken, and there will always be training and retraining of your personnel. That sums up my presentation, and our contact information is there for both myself and Charles at easconsultinggroup.com.
Great, thank you both so much for a great presentation. And I wanted to just point out a couple of things. Kathy mentioned the acronyms. If you haven't already seen it, on the EAS website, we have a great resource under the Resources tab, where you'll find glossary terms. They're categorized by commodity. So there's a glossary for foods, and we invite you to check there. We have a number of different things. Secondly, I wanted to just mention, since we're running a little short, our next webinar that you are welcome to join us on is on October 29th at 1 p.m. It is going to cover customs and border protection and prior imported food. So that will be a great one. If you have not already registered, we would love to have you in the audience. And now we have got time for a couple questions. And the first question I will let Kathy and Charles decide. But it is there a sampling process of raw materials where, I'm sorry, if there is a sampling process in the raw materials warehouse, is it still exempt? And so Kathy, Charles, either one of you can take that.
This is Charles, a raw materials warehouse. I'm going to make some assumptions that it's a dry material, and the sampling would be of a limited number of containers. No, I think it is exempt, but I also am not certain of that, so it's something that I would look into further before giving an authoritative answer.
Okay, thank you. We'll get an answer to that one and provide it. Our next question is, if a food facility does not have a vulnerability, is the facility required to have a written food defense plan?
Yes. It has to document that there are no vulnerabilities.
Okay, great.
Right, I agree. So there would be the vulnerability assessment, and you would, the food defense team would document the vulnerability assessment. I agree.
Okay, great. Third question, will the FDA inspector take photos of or photocopies of the food defense plan?
During the QuickCheck, no. In the future, it's possible, but not during a QuickCheck.
Okay, great. I think that's probably all we have time for. If anyone has any additional questions, you're welcome to send them in. You have my email from the registration. You could write a note to Kathy and Charles as well. And I also just want to mention, if you are in need of assistance with food defense services, EAS, of course, offers training, auditing. We help develop SOPs. We can help your facility with mock inspections. So a wide range of options and services we can provide to assist in this area. So thank you everyone out in the audience for joining us, and we hope to see you on October 29th for the Customs Border Patrol Prior Notice of Imported Foods webinar. And thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great day.